Very last featured speaker talk. I am incredibly excited to welcome Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is relatively new to UNL, and we have not been able to meet in person yet, but I'm really excited to watch this talk today. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Deirdre.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. This is, at least for me, I'm on Central Standard Time in the United States. So it's a little bit after 12:40 noon. And so I really thank you for taking the time to come and have a conversation and hopefully learn about a topic that really plagues us all, no matter what field we're in. If we're educators, we are confronted with racism because every human being has a raced, as we call it in history, a raced experience, right? We live, particularly in this country, by boxes that categorize us, by Black or white or Hispanic or Latinx or Native. And so these concepts of race that were man-made also create a social context where racism comes out of that. And so my job today is, how do we talk about racism, right? Talking about race is a little easier, but talking about racism fearlessly, as my talk is labeled, is a bit more difficult. I am an interloper. I am not a scientist. But as the director of a medical humanities program and someone who is involved in the history of medicine, I tend to talk about race through my own work in the 19th century. I look at racial formation theory, but also I am almost always asked about the effects of medical racism. Because although I often joke with audiences that I talk to, I write about dead people, right? I'm looking at people who lived in a different time period, a different era. But folk are very interested in the legacy of medical racism, particularly in the history of gynecology and obstetrics, and that's my area of specialty. And so often the questions I get are directly related to anti-Blackness and medical racism. So let me share my screen with you, and we can dive right in. I'm also going to share with you as well that it's not my job to convince you about whether racism exists or not. It's my job today to talk about the ways that we can have intellectual discourse, how we can talk about this without a kind of crippling fear. Because what I've also noticed as someone who is trained in the humanities and the social sciences, there's often a lot of fraught feelings around racism, right? We call it in history, the politics of white guilt and Black rage. And so how do we get past all of that when talking about a field that has, up until the last few years, been seen as one that is neutral, politically neutral, racially neutral. And so we're starting to understand that racism has in fact influenced every sector of our society, particularly in the United States. All right, so critical questions that we'll attempt to answer and hopefully have a discourse about. Race and science, fraught relationship, especially since scientists have established that race is a social construct, right? So I often use my life as a kind of hook to get folk to think about this. And when I say folk, in particular, my students or audiences that I'm invited to speak to. And I often tell them the ways in which race as a social construct or category have changed over time. So for instance, I am married, and I'm married to a Black man, right? When he was born in 1973, the census listed Black, not even African American. Now this is the rub. His mother is white and his father African American. Had he been born in, let's say, 1678 in the colony of Virginia with a white mother and a Black father, he would have been considered white, because in 1662, a law came about that essentially said that children born with a Black parent would inherit the status of the mother. And so because his mother was white, he'd be considered white. Well, all of a sudden in 1973, he's Black, because there were these rules about one drop and what that meant. Had he been born in 2014, the form or the box might have been a little different, because now you have a multiracial or other category. And so my husband's parentage never changed, but the ways in which this country has constructed race has changed. And so science has been thought to be value neutral, as if racism, a byproduct of the creation of race, had no relationship to the field. Ruha Benjamin, who is a sociologist and also a historian of science and technology at Princeton University, is a really popular speaker with scientists and tech folk. And she often uses an example that many of us in the humanities use when we think about the ways that science as an actual field of study is not living or breathing. It's scientists who infuse, right, beliefs into the work and into sometimes the suppositions and research and all of those things. And so often Ruha Benjamin will talk about this viral video that came out a few years ago. Some of you might be familiar with it, with two friends, one with darker skin, one with lighter skin. And the ways in which you would have these touch-free soap dispensers or sinks, right, with the infrared technology, and the friend with the skin that's darker is trying to get the water to turn on. This has happened to me. I suspect this happened to you. It doesn't turn on sometimes with the first go. But the lighter skinned friend, right, or the person with the lighter hue, immediately, right, the water comes on or the soap is dispensed. And so are we going to call a machine racist, or even the person who created this technology? No. But what we can say are the consequences when lighter skinned, right? Lighter skin is normalized. It affects those who don't have that, who don't possess it. And so something as simple as just putting your hand under water or soap dispenser, right, kind of shows this on a very low tech level. So as educators and scientists, how can we reconcile the long history of racism and, yes, science? It's pretty easy for me. I wrote a book called Medical Bondage that's about the history of obstetrics and gynecology in this country. And I begin in the era of slavery. So it doesn't take a lot for me to convince people that anti-Blackness or racism exists. But I suspect for many of you who are not historians, right, who are not necessarily dealing with a long past, if you're confronted with this, how do we talk about this, right? So I came up with a couple of strategies that I think might be useful. So acknowledging the elephant in the room, right? Acknowledge that although science is a branch of study, just like history or chemistry or sociology, right? Scientists, who are the actual human beings, have biases. We all do. And our biases can show up in our work and our research. That doesn't mean that we're not privileging objectivity, but as human beings, we have to be aware that we do have biases. Also, scholars, artists, journalists, and I could go on and on, have long studied racism. There are a number of resources at our disposal. There are books and articles, artistic pieces that address this issue. In fact, I used to live in New York just a year ago. And there was an off-Broadway play called Behind the Sheet. And it was a fictionalized account of the life and work of Dr. James Marion Sims, who is known as the father of American gynecology. He was a 19th century gynecological surgeon and pioneer in his field. And the artist, Charlie Yvonne Simpson, based the play off of my book, right? And so there's a way that people were brought into history of medicine, right, through this artistic production. And so there are all kinds of ways that we can tackle these issues through the resources that are available. And so how do we do this? Communication strategies. At heart, I'm a storyteller, right? I like to hook people in with a story. And I mean, at least according to my friends and family, I'm kind of funny. So I know talking about slavery and medical experimentation can be very heavy. It's depressing. Nobody is going to come out of there feeling, exuberated. But what I tend to do is humanize the historical actors. And I tend to, second thing, contextualize, right, the past. I contextualize the studies, the data, and the statistics. So for example, when I did my postdoc at the University of Virginia, it was from 2008 to 2009. A few years later, and you all know, right? UVA, founded by Thomas Jefferson, this country's third president, very elite space. It's really competitive to get into any of the schools, but particularly for those who are applying for medical school. Well, just 5 years after I left the University of Virginia, the medical school personnel, the faculty, started to conduct a study because they wanted to know what were the racial opinions of medical students and residents. And so they conducted this study in 2014. It was published in a leading medical journal in 2016, and it made quite a splash. And what was found, medical students, residents, overwhelmingly believed that there were biological distinctions between Black and white people. And so some of those beliefs, based on their own education, right? Based on this really old, outdated racial science that kind of comes from the 18th century and the 19th century, that Black people didn't experience pain, or if they did, it was lessened. Black people had thicker skin than white people. Black people's blood coagulated more than white people, right? And I could go on and on. And so when I'm talking about these things, right, these students don't come into these spaces thinking I have anti-Black beliefs, but it's the way in which things have been taught and believed over time, and that they're sometimes not challenged. And so I don't understand, because I wasn't there, I don't necessarily know what the context was for medical researchers at the University of Virginia's medical school to conduct this research, but they did, and they found really disturbing results, right, from that research. And so then you can begin to talk about the ways that the legacy of these beliefs, right, in this kind of difference, this biological difference, has impacted the way that certain patients are treated. I mean, there are a number of things. So often contextualizing the studies, the data, and the statistics, right? What it can do is deepen the understanding of students, colleagues, and the audiences that you're speaking to. Also, this is never, ever helpful unless you are a minister, pastor, rabbi, right, priest. Don't sermonize. It just isn't helpful, right? Your role as a communicator is to explain a thing clearly without jargon. And you have to be okay. Everybody won't believe you. That's okay. It's okay. As long as you have communicated your idea, right? A theory, a postulation, research clearly so that people understand that these are nuanced and complicated, you've done your job as a communicator. Also, to be an empathetic listener. What does that mean, right? An empathetic listener to who you're speaking to. And once again, I always kind of pull from my own life. I speak to diverse audiences. And by that, I don't mean just kind of like if a person looks different, but what I mean is I speak to people outside the academy, inside the academy, sometimes little kids, in senior centers. I mean, it runs the gamut, right? And so I listen first to what they're asking. Because I do the history of slavery as well, I'll often get young Black people, typically students, right? If I can generalize, typically young Black college students. And they say, hey, I've heard of, or I've read this thing about intergenerational trauma. And so I think your book is great because what you're showing is that Black people have been traumatized since slavery and it's encoded in our DNA. First, I listen. And I said, okay, so you're making a statement. Do you have a question? Because I said, I'll try to answer the question. And they'll say, oh yeah, so can you help me to prove that Black people suffer intergenerational trauma from slavery, and that's why we're more susceptible to X, Y, and Z disease or disorder. And so what I then do is, once again, rely on contextualization. And I'll say, I think I know what you're talking about. And so I'll say, oh, you're talking about the trauma studies that have been done on the children of Nazi survivors. And there's also another one that was done on lab mice. And then I talk about the ways in which the gene expression returns to normal a normal expression after about 2 to 4 generations. And so then I'll say to them, so do you mean that Black people are so biologically different from other human beings that ever since the age of slavery, our bodies just somehow can't recover in terms of our gene expression? And I said, because if you're saying that, you're believing in a racial science, right, that's been debunked in, a long, long time ago. And so then that gets them to think about what epigenetics or this intergenerational trauma means, right? And so I'm just kind of presenting the context for them. What I also find is really useful in terms of talking about racism is answering the 5 W's, right? And journalists use this: who, what, when, where, and why, right? If you can answer those questions as best you can, what it also allows us to do is to have a fuller, deeper conversation, right? Without, and I don't want to legislate people's emotions, but without getting bogged down in having to, kind of do this tit for tat back and forth. Debates are typically good in terms of performative, kind of a performative thing, but debates don't always change minds. So I don't necessarily get into debates with people because I just don't find them very helpful. But what I do try to do that goes right back up to context is have I answered the kind of simple who, what, when, where, why, if it's applicable, right? And so these are, I'm going to now stop sharing the screen. These are the ways that I tend to talk about, particularly as a Black woman who studies racial formation, history of science, slavery, all of these kinds of really heavy topics, and have to answer questions that are rooted in a 21st century reality, not an 18th or 19th century one. And I haven't had tomatoes thrown at me yet. I've not been heckled that badly yet. People tend to recognize that I'm excited about this. I want us to come away with accurate information. And to also, question sometimes, what are the sources that we're reading? Where are we getting this information from? Have we read widely? And just because we are situated in a particular field doesn't necessarily mean that we can't read widely. So although I'm a historian, I have to read medical journals, right, in order to keep myself educated about a topic that people rely on me for. And as scientists, so whether you're a biologist, whether you are in organic chemistry, there are ways that you are still, even in your work, going to be confronted with questions that move you outside of the lab, for instance, right? Where students might have read something or seen a meme or, saw something on the internet and they want to get and rely on your expertise. And so if you're uncomfortable talking about it, right? If there's a lot of fear and anxiety, right, people are going to have a hard time understanding you. And so just as you have mastered getting that MA or that PhD, right, you can also master the communication around racism. And I think do it in a way that is compassionate, thoughtful, but also relies on accurate information and also shows that not everybody agrees, right? We also know that there are disagreements around racism in science as well, and to present those as fairly and completely as you can. I see I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to end here. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask people to start putting questions in the chat right now. I think I'm going to start with a question about those intergenerational effects. And I feel like you stopped right before saying, like, how do you actually address these things with people? And I would love to hear that answer.
Yeah, I think that was probably the most shocking to me. There is a scholar, she is a sociologist, and she's written a book called Post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so I'm going to just say this, her facts are often correct. I think her analysis is a bit inaccurate. I'll just say that. So for me, and I, once again, recognizing my audience, people see a Black woman who is coming to talk about Black people who were owned, who were experimented on. And so I think, once again, this is me kind of, guessing, but I think I'm onto something. Black people expect me to be able to absolve our ancestors, right? Because of this exploitative practice that helped to develop a particular branch of medicine. And so when I have young people, I am so compassionate and empathetic to them because they want to know, why in the world do we have all of these damning stats? Why is it that we're the ones who are getting hypertension and diabetes and, XYZ? Why are Black mothers experiencing a maternal crisis? And they want to be able to have concrete scientific data. And so they read this book by this scholar, or they've seen something on the internet that says the reason is because we can't ever get rid of the intergenerational trauma that stresses our body, that creates low-level inflammation. And so they are, I think, really attracted to the kind of scientific language because science seems, unmovable, right? If it's scientific, that means it's real. And so I have to say to them, yes, these studies have shown that there is a trauma that can be, there's a trauma that can affect the body of the victims and also their children. But I have to share with them, I'm like, in the United States, slavery ended in 1865. So is it that Black people are so different than every other human being on the face of the earth that we just can't get rid of the trauma from slavery? Now, it can be other things, right? A kind of anti-Black experience, but to say somehow that our bodies are biologically constructed in a way that's different than yours, right? Or different than someone from Malaysia or someone from India it's inaccurate, because if that's the case, if you needed an organ transplant from me, then you wouldn't be able to get it, and vice versa. And so I have to let them know that that really stems from a kind of old school 18th century racial science that scientists don't embrace anymore. And that also is really damaging because it kind of goes along the lines of racial essentialism and biological determinism. And we've also abandoned those beliefs as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Okay, Natalie says, I loved your empathetic methods of directing conversation you gave in your example about intergenerational trauma. Do you have suggestions of how we can learn, develop, and practice those skills?
Yes. Okay. Once again, I can only use me as an example. I would often joke, I'm married to a Black man who looks white. I'm a Black Buddhist and I do the history of medicine, right? So I'm kind of an anomaly in certain ways. Buddhists are taught, at least in my school of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, empathy is just listening. And the way we've been taught in our Western context is to do this, yeah, because we want people to know, yes, I hear you, I agree. And I'm not saying that kind of nonverbal communication isn't affirming, but
that's totally what I'm doing, by the way.
What I would say is listen without response, be intentional, hear what they're really asking. And often I was a college student. I was a college student in the 90s. So, it was the age of, it wasn't Black Lives Matter, but it was like Rodney King and the LAPD and the uprisings that happened during that time. So I recognize that need to want to know, why is this thing happening? Why is this kind of, trauma constantly with us? And so I really listen. I then will repeat. I think that's important. Let me, and if it's unclear, let me repeat back to you what I've heard. Is this what you're asking? And that gives the person the power, right? Their own agency to say, yes, I was, or no, I wasn't. And then they can then better articulate what they were trying to say as well. So I think that's a strategy too, asking questions, just to get clarity and specificity. And sometimes, like I said, people will disagree. Well, I don't think that's so. Okay, thank you for sharing. And you just move on. Because it's not your job to convince everybody. It's your job to communicate effectively your work, your research.
Great. Okay. Michelle says, I've been wrestling with how to talk with youth. middle and high school about the nature of science as a human endeavor and how scientists can be biased and how what we read in books is not always objective. Do you have advice for talking with youth about this without perpetuating the idea that science is arbitrary?
Exactly what you asked in your in your way that you constructed your question, I think is perfect, because the ways in which we are taught. And I always tell my students, if Dr. Cooper Owens ever asks you a question that's yes or no, either or, trust me, I'm setting you up, because things are much more nuanced than sometimes either or. Those binaries, they can be helpful, but in these exchanges, I think we can kind of place them to the side. And just in the ways that you're talking, right, Michelle, the way in which you phrase this question, but also provided some comments, you've already explained to your students, this is not an either or proposition. What we're trying to do is understand the both and, right? That things can happen at the same time. We can walk and chew gum. And so then how do we think about science in a way that might go against some of the things that you've read or some of the things that you've been taught? That doesn't mean we're anti-science, right? Doesn't mean that we want to dog scientists. That's not the case at all. We all rely on the fruits of scientists. But what that means is we can say, hey, let's look at the ways that textbooks have changed over time and talking about, certain things. And so I often will say when I'm teaching a US history survey class, so people believe the world was flat. We later learned it wasn't. How did that change the ways that folk who had been influenced by those scientific beliefs, how did it change the way that they moved in the world? They thought about the world now that they saw the world as a sphere, right? As opposed to something that was on a plane or flat. And so you can just use those kinds of examples from whatever field you're in to have students to start thinking about both and as opposed to either or. And I think that that can create a nuanced conversation.
That is excellent. Okay, Tien asks, Dr. Owens, your talk is absolutely amazing. Thank you for your insights. I love your examples on providing the contexts and having nuanced and complicated conversations with others on race. I agree with you on debates and on how debates tend to become performative and can be unhelpful. So do you have any advice on how to avoid debates and start to have conversations with other in our conversations on race?
Ooh, yeah, don't argue with people on social media, I can tell you that. If you want to have a restful night, don't do that. That is an either or for me. Don't argue with people on the internet. But I think in terms of like our normalized asking questions, kind of seeing where people are, doing, once again, extensive reading kind of outside of our fields is really important. And then, one-on-one conversations tend to be better. I've had a lot of conversations with folk about race across all racial groups because I'm a teacher. I teach lots of different people, but also I think in my personal life, being married to someone who is on paper like me, right? We're both Black people, but he looks so different than me. That people respond to us differently. So it's also kind of forced me in my personal life to have to confront race in a different way or racism in a different way, because I grew up with my parents who looked the same. He grew up with parents who looked different, right? And so the ways in which he had to move in the world was very different than mine. But when we got together and we looked different, it was like, oh my God, how do I deal with this without pulling out all my hair? And so when people would sometimes make simple statements, right, about race or racism, oh my gosh, I bet that when you have children, they're going to be so pretty. And I would say, oh, really? Thank you for that compliment. But why do you say that? Once again, I put it back on them. And they recognize at that moment, because it's like, oh, well, biracial people are really pretty. I was like, really? Because I know some ones who are not that pretty to me. But, and then I kind of make a joke, use the humor, and they recognize, oh gosh, where did I get that from? Why was that taught to me? And so without me having to necessarily say, well, read this book and that book and this scholarship, I can just ask questions that gets them to probe when was I first taught this fiction that a certain group looked better than another group because of the admixture of whiteness, right? I don't have to use those terminologies, but I think the probing questions gets them to say, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. No, I know you didn't. I know you didn't. And I thank you for the compliment, but I just am interested in why that was the particular question or comment around beauty. And then they're like, oh, wow. And so those are the little exchanges I think we can have interpersonally with friends or family that might get people to think differently, myself included, to think differently about the ways in which anti-racism can be a project that we're all invested in.
Yeah, thank you. I know that it's been amazing to me during this pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, how uneducated I am in so many different ways. And so I really, really appreciate, and I'm sure speaking for everyone, you and others coming and talking with us. But at this point, I know everybody has had a long schedule of talks and meetings and presentations. And so I am going to cut us off here for this discussion. There are lots of additional questions and comments in the chat. Many of them are just praising you on what an amazing talk it was, how insightful it was, and how thankful they are for you to have talked with us. So, yeah. Actually, is there a way, if people have additional questions, that they could contact you?
Yes, I've put it in social media. I mean, social media in chat. Somebody just said, I just read social media, sorry. I'm gonna put in my email address and you can always email me.
Perfect.
So I just put it in the chat section. Oh, except I did it privately to the last person who commented. So let's put it again. dcooperowens2@unl.edu. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad all of you joined me. Thank you, Eileen, for giving me the opportunity.